I have very long intros and bios to the 5 speakers, but they've asked me to keep it short and crisp, and all the information is on the website if you want to find out more. So here, first up is Susheila Nasta, who is the long-time editor of Wasafiri, that very, very important magazine of international and contemporary writing that she founded back in 1984. A literary activist, writer, and presenter, she is now Emeritus Professor of Modern Literature at the Open University. She is editing the Cambridge History of Black and Asian British Writing with Mark Stein beside her. And Mark is Chair of English, Postcolonial and Media Studies at the WWU in Münster, the Westfälische Wilhelms-Universität. Yeah? In research and teaching, Mark takes an interest in Anglophone cultural production from around the globe, and he has a number of books to his name. Currently, then, he's working on the Cambridge history with Susheila. Beside Mark is Florian Stadtler, who is Senior Lecturer in Global Literatures at the University of Exeter. He's published on South Asian and British Asian cinema, most recently the monograph Fiction, Film and Indian Popular Cinema, and he is reviews editor for Wasafiri. Beside Florian is Henghameh Saroukhani, who is Assistant Professor in Literatures and Cultures of the Black Atlantic at St. Mary's University, Canada. She has published on the work of Linton Kwesi Johnson and Bernardine Evaristo, who we of course met earlier in this series, and she's written on Black British poetry and fiction in the late 20th century. And then beside her, at the other end of the table, is Gail Low, who teaches creative writing and book history at the University of Dundee. She is the author of White Skins, Black Masks, that I know many of us know, and has co-edited A Black British Canon with Marion Wynne Davis and The Voyage Out with Kirsty Gunn. You're all very welcome. We're very, very excited to hear you, and I'm now going to hand over to Susheila to start us off.
Thank you. I've been told that the theme of the seminars this term has been reading and identity, and how we identify through what we read. Obviously, as Elec has already pointed out, we're all literary critics, or crickets, as my daughter once called them. Probably talk too much. And in a sense, this particular history has been quite long in coming, and actually is quite late in coming, I would say, in terms of British writing. I'm going to start off by saying a few general things. You probably discussed all these kinds of things over the term about reading and writing and being a reader and a writer, because obviously with a different hat on, I am editor of Wasafiri, and I've in fact published most of the writers that you've had reading this term. And those things, I think, relate to this whole idea also of at home. I wondered, I'm sure you did intend this to have a kind of double meaning, the at home, but of course I thought of immediately at home, i.e. Britain and the nation, and the idea of a so-called national canon, but also the at home, where you're a visitor coming in, and of course those kinds of streams, those visitors, those migrants, are also part of at home in our book, if you like. So those quotes are just really food for your imagination. The last two relate quite closely to the theoretical frameworks in our book. The first two are just two that I like, and one of them, the extract from Eddie Bohr's poem, There's No Such Thing as Only Literature, was the title of an article I wrote in the 80s about why the British canon should perhaps try and expand its borders. And when I was thinking about today, I thought it seems incredible that one's still actually having so many of those conversations. So I'm just going to say a little bit and then hand over to Mark. So basically, however we look at it, whether through a personal lens, a community lens, or from an international critical perspective, it's clear that literature, whether for writers or listeners increasingly, changes things, takes us on a voyage. So a child reading a bedtime story looks for worlds beyond those he's familiar with. Prisoners in cells read to take them out of their confinement. People at funerals perhaps gain release by listening to a poem read. It takes them possibly out of their grief. Activists use literature to fight oppression, and so on. So it's through writing and through reading we can express ourselves, learn, shape identities, and as readers we continually open ourselves to that and the perspectives of others. This was particularly important to me personally as a mixed-race child growing up in Suffolk in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when I did not encounter texts that spoke to me directly. And I didn't encounter texts like that till I went to the University of Kent and began to read authors such as Jean Rhys or V.S. Naipaul, Sam Selvon or Derek Walcott. And you know that famous line in Wide Sargasso Sea, there's the other side always. And I remember that really spoke to me as a sort of 19-year-old. And I know many other critics, writers have made that point, like Carol Phillips talks about his childhood in Leeds when he says, you know, he was in a situation where he was in a sense literally, culturally starving. And if we think about today, with the re-emergence of the xenophobic discourse of the 70s and 80s following Brexit, it becomes increasingly important that literature isn't just the art for art's sake thing, but it's also a political tool. And I'm not saying that should be a one-sided tool, but it is an important political tool. So it's with that kind of framework, if you think of a history of where maybe I'm coming into it as a critic, and I think Mark too, and I'm sure he'll explain this himself, that we started to put together this history. We were approached by CUP. It's obviously a formidable task because there is no one history. There can be no one unified history of Black and Asian British writing. There's no one geography, there's no one cultural influence, there's no one way of thinking about Black or Asian, or indeed putting them together, because in fact it was only in the sort of 80s that Black and Asian began to be separated as terminology. So we've got quite a problematic scenario in terms of actually trying to construct this history, and we wanted to avoid falling into the trap of simply doing a narrative of reclamation or retrieval or as an opposition to complicity, but to offer reading through different theoretical and historical lenses, creating a history that runs both, because CUP would want this as a Cambridge history chronologically as a vertical history, but also horizontally, so that where there are all these uneven shapes and gaps and silences, because there is no straight chronology of Black and Asian British writing, you can make links across a continuum in terms of symbols, tropes, preoccupations, as Linus actually said in her book on this subject. I think it was in 2002. So that's the kind of way we're coming into this, and there are lots of problematics with the history and how we might put it together, but I'm going to hand over to Mark now to explain a bit about that and the structure of the book and what we did with that.
Yes, all right. Well, thanks very much. Can you all hear me in the back? If my voice is flagging, do let me know. Yeah, I'm also very pleased to be here, and very pleased for us to be doing this project together. I'm also intrigued that today, as Elika has shown, we're interested in reading, in the act of reading. And I thought I'd give you a quote from a book that's very close to my heart. It was published in the year of the French Revolution, 1789, by Olada Equiano. And it's quite a well-known text, I realise that, but I thought I'd give you that quote. He says, "I had often seen my master employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books, as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. For that purpose, I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put it to my ears when alone, in hopes it would answer me, and I've been very much concerned when it remained silent." So this is the trope of the talking book. Equiano was a slave at that time, and he'd observed others reading, wasn't allowed himself to read and write. He did learn it later, but he was fascinated with reading, and at the time he thought, because he'd seen people moving their lips, that it was the book actually talking back to the reader. And of course that is what books do. You had that quote from when you were 19 years old, Jean Rhys, right? Books do speak to us, ideally. But what I find fascinating about that is clearly it's about great writers that inspire us, but you need great readers, right? You need to grow up and be a reader as well, and all great writers are clearly great readers as well. Equiano's book, The Interesting Narrative, falls into many genres. It's an autobiography, spiritual autobiography, it's a slave narrative, it's a political text, a petition presented to Parliament to further the cause of abolition, but it's also a story of him not just learning to write and writing his book, self-publishing his book, but developing into a reader, a formidable reader, and in that way entering British culture and leaving a legacy, a will. He was the first black person in England who required a will because he'd made money and bequeathed that to his daughter. So the act of reading is resonant, I think, for us in many ways. Now, he says he took up the book in order to learn how all things had a beginning. And this is, in a sense, what we're constructing when we're constructing a history, like the one we're confronted with. And at the same time, you said it's a formidable task, yes, but it's also one we're conflicted about. A history carries authority, and this field clearly needs that authority, very much so. And at the same time, we don't want a book that's so authoritative as to not allow, for this field to develop further and for its openings to remain visible. So we have to strike a balance here, and that's why you made the point about the horizontal, the lateral, the vertical connections. So it's not just a chronological history that starts at the beginning and then takes you through to the end, and we don't have chapters focusing on individual authors, but rather, we're always trying to encourage the contributors to interconnect different writers, but also between different chapters. So in a sense, I shouldn't be saying this, but it's going to be quite a messy history, because it is a messy history that we're seeking to represent. So in a sense, it's about undoing the authority at the same time as one is constructing it. And that's why I think this quote up here is quite interesting by Trinh Minh Ha, bang in the middle. She says, "Despite all our desperate eternal attempts to separate, contain and mend, categories always leak." And so that quote speaks to the requirement that we face as academics to establish categories, right? That's what we learn and that's what we teach. We work within categories, but we also question them, we reform them, and we need to move beyond them. We're meaning-making animals. We cannot but categorize, create boxes, even whilst we remain aware that they are, of necessity, provisional at best. So Trinh Minh Ha calls our efforts not just eternal, but also desperate, because we rely on and indeed depend upon categorization, discrimination, on distinguishing one from the other. And as we differentiate between different texts and authors, different genres and formats, different literary periods, and so forth, we insert separations, we introduce rifts, and we create spaces of containment. And these are, politically speaking, quite dangerous acts, which at the same time we think and feel need to happen. And so it's good to actually see that Trinh Minh reminds us categories always leak. We may wish to mend them, but there is leakage, there is seepage. And so, I'm personally quite taken by the notion of porosity here, right? I think we need to emphasize the leaks of those categories in as much as we need the categories, yes, but the porosity, the leakage is crucial. And that also refers to the core terms, Black and Asian, Black British and British Asian. You've already indicated, there was a point in history when the Caribbean artist movement was very strong, that politically speaking, Black was used in an overarching sense, and it was, covering people and writings, of Black and Asian provenance. That moment we've moved beyond, but we don't now have two sort of pure terms, Black and Asian, that are transparent. Quite the contrary. So these very terms are messy as well. Now, you promised that I'd talk about how the book is structured. I've probably used up at least half my time, if not more. So I should quickly say that we have 3 sections in the book, and they are, you won't be surprised to hear, chronological sections, those 3 sections. The first,
Let us get away with that.
So the first part of the book, is just 5 chapters, but it covers the 18th and the 19th century. It's called Early Formations. And then we quickly move over to the 20th century, and we're very happy to have 2 contributors from that massive part. Part 2 is called Uneven Histories, Changing Landscapes in the 20th Century. And the third part, basically the 21st century, is represented here by Florian. And I'll find the title if I can, because I don't remember it for some reason right now. Here it is, Writing Contemporary Britain, Post-Ethnic and Transnational Imaginaries. And it's interesting, I think we both agree there, this third title here, Writing Contemporary Britain, Post-Ethnic and Transnational Imaginaries, yes, it is how we see the present moment, but we see connections from that present moment way back to the 18th century. So even our 3 sections, we emphasize, the messiness, the interconnectedness, which will be challenging for the readers, and we'll have to make that clear in the introduction, how this is intended. But that's the only way in which we thought we could conceive of a history like that. There is no precedent for this work. So we want to open this up rather than foreclose it, and that's our way of doing so. You need some sort of structure, obviously, and you have to organize this, but we're emphasizing the openings and the overlaps as much as the distinctions, the divisions in this work. And I want to return to the theme of your seminar, Great Writers Inspire at Home, and the question of what reading and writing might do. For Equiano, it was formative. It was, clearly formative that he learned how to read and to write, and he was able to obtain freedom and move beyond his existence as a slave. I think, more generally speaking, reading, the act of reading, has the potential to set all of us free, and the act of writing is, ideally speaking, a transformative act. Right, making worlds was up there on the screen when Elke introduced all of us. I think writing, books literally creates worlds. It doesn't just allow us to see the world through the eyes of someone else. It literally contributes to the transformation of the world we live in. So reading and writing, from my perspective, are political acts. And certainly for Equiano, who wrote this book as a petition to achieve the abolition, to end the slave trade, he saw his writing as a political act. And it was, he was successful, of course, at the end of the day. Now, I haven't checked my time, but it may be a moment to pass.
Can I just say one thing just before we do, which is just simply because I saw the connection actually when I was sitting there watching that video you showed at the beginning, which of course the last point Mark made about writing worlds. Of course, that's what or at least that's how I perceive that video, in terms of the different imaginative worlds that you might enter through reading.
I will hand over, but I will say one more thing. And that is, we're constructing this history of Black British and British Asian writing, but all those texts are more than what we allow them to be. So that's another point of connection that we're heeding. They are, in a sense, translocal texts. They gesture elsewhere. So what At Home is specifically for the texts that are being covered in that book, needs to be established for each and every text. So they point to the subcontinent, they point to Africa, they point to the Caribbean, and they cannot be read ignoring that sort of deictic quality of pointing out, of reaching out. And of course they relate to Britain just as well. But this, is another element of this messiness, I think, that we're confronted with. But it's part of the excitement of those texts.
I'm going to say that I'm a little bit like a cuckoo in a different kind of nest. Like one great big fat cuckoo in that kind of nest. Partially because I'm coming from it in a completely different way. I did ask in my defense, Mark and Susheila, should I really be here? And they said, yeah, just come and do it. Because my research has really been about publishing history. It's been about how manuscripts are transformed into books. And I take nothing for granted. So I'm quite interested in the edifices or the infrastructures that support the circulation of text as books, not simply ideas, but in actually producing a text for publication and producing it as a book, you shift, if you like, that whole field. So I'm really interested in the circulation of text as books. I'm interested in editors editing text, not taking the text itself for granted. So, for example, the big case of Raymond Carver and Gordon's Lish editing of Raymond Carver, all of a sudden, that was a real bombshell to my students, how much intervention is made on a text that you take for granted as simply being a authorial kind of signature. So I'm interested in publishers, critics, the marketplace, literary and educational, and how these shape audiences, how these shape books, how these shape readers. Publishing, first of all, I'd have to say, is a commercial industry. It's a business and has commercial it's run along commercial lines. So I'm thinking about books here as cultural and aesthetic and educational objects, but I'm also thinking about books as commodities, if you like, within that kind of literary ecology of letters. So generally, to put my cards up front, I'm interested in why certain books are published and certain books aren't published. What are the many hands that have gone to shaping a book, rather just the one single romantic hand that you presume is the author. I'm interested in things like editing. I'm interested in designers that actually, those paratextual elements that package a book, that shape the way you might react on whether or not you might pick that book up in the first place. I'm also interested in how books are talked about, how discourses are used to open up books as readers. And these might be through, I suppose, these discourses might be generated through the marketplace, editing, reviewing, reviewing cultures. They might be generated through educational institutions like here, or like the universities we all represent, or they might be generated by formal aesthetic concerns, but all these open up books in certain kinds of ways. And I also want to think about the strengths and limitations of each particular way of interacting with a book along those lines. I'm also interested, I suppose, in what extra textual factors impact on the way the book is put together or the way it is read. So I'm going to start my short presentation, I hope this is going to be short, with some of the 4 areas that I'm quite concerned with, I'm quite interested in. And these 4 areas are, I suggest, distinct, but they're also overlapping. And then I'm going to provide, I suppose, some examples of the ways you might think about that. So first of all, I think you need supportive networks. And you need, if you don't have supportive networks, you need patronage. So for example, in the 30-minute broadcast program that I think Mark referred to, Caribbean Voices, between 1943 and 1958. Now that really helped encourage a literary ecology, an ecology for literature on the Anglophone Caribbean islands by putting literature on a professional and institutional footing. And I think that's quite important to me, the professional and institutional footing. first of all, by acting as a paying publisher, writers were paid for the stuff that actually they sent to London, which was then broadcast and read out on the BBC, especially at a time when there were very few places that actually paid for writing on the islands itself. So one can think of Caribbean Voices as growing that kind of cultural infrastructure for writing locally, but also those transnational exchanges between London and the islands, so enabling a kind of literary connection to occur between London and the islands. For both sides of the divide, that was mutually beneficial. And it's not only a one-way traffic. Now, the gravitation to London of that generation of writers who are now part of a Caribbean canon, but also in some ways part of a black British canon. And one can think of Samuel Selvin, George Lamming, Edgar Mittelhauser, Andrew Salkey, James Berry, Wilson Harris, all of those. The arrival of those writers was in part driven by a belief that you could work professionally as a writer. And I think this is important, that you can make a living professionally as a writer and be part of an intellectual and established network. And so Caribbean Voices in some ways became the magnet for, if you like, that generation of writers. Now, there were other organizations like the Transcription Center who did that for Africa, but there's a much more checkered and much more troubled history with Transcription Center, who was in some ways funded by the CIA, and everyone knew that. And it was open joke with Soyinka actually writing, yeah, my letter's going to be passed to your CIA friends, to Dan Sturden, he said. Now, London publishing at that time in the 1950s and in the early 60s seemed open to new writing, publishing, and it prompts, I suppose, Diana Attill's very famous comment, everyone actually quotes it, that it was easier for a little time, it was easier to be a black writer in London and get your book published and reviewed than it was for a white writer. Whatever you think of that statement, and I don't think it's entirely true, it's quite interesting that kind of sense that there were new possibilities with all these small publishers that were publishing, if you like, writers. So, for example, Alan Wingate, who was essentially Andrew Deutsch, publishing Sam Selvin. Alan Wingate, not Alan Wingate, but under Andrew Deutsch published, of course, V.S. Naipaul, Michael Anthony, and a whole kind of generation of those kinds of writers. And also, one has to think about that networks of support and patronage in the literary establishment in Britain at that time, particularly in the London literary establishment. So you think of the famous figures like Walter Allen, Francis Wyndham, who worked with Deutsch as a reader for a little while, Alan Ross with the London Magazine, William Plumer, who read as a reader for Jonathan Cape and actually advocated the publication of Derek Walcott. So there's a whole, if you like, network that one has to unearth and a shaping of connections in that way. Now, patronage is to a significant extent support on someone else's terms. And the reasons for that support, and I've written about it and people have, kind of range from, I suppose, genuine curiosity, exoticism, that's a kind of huge factor in that. Literature also as part of an international and global network in a republic of letters. And again, this is really important. There was also a shared investment in the legacy of modernism, so lots of writers that came over and reading acceptance letters by John Stolsworthy on someone like Camus Braithwaite and locating him as part of, if you like, a tradition of literary modernism. And also there's a feeling, I suppose, that there is a real schools market out there that these writers could very well publish to and earning huge profits for these publishers, if you like. So the educational reform, educational curriculum was to move in the direction of cultural independence and decolonization. Well, here was a killing to be made, and hence the rise of the educational publishers series. Now, education is, so here I come to my second kind of block, education. Literature is read by the general public for leisure purposes, for pleasure and entertainment, but literature is also edifying, it's also educational, it's also instructive, it also opens up all kinds of ethical, aesthetic agendas. This, of course, all of these affect why books are published and why we go to read these particular books. in the 1960s and 70s, which my work mostly is located in, the rise of series that I can remember as a postgraduate student, as a student, the African Writer Series, the Caribbean Writer Series, Three Crowns with Methuen and Oxford University Press, with Longman Caribbean, with the Caribbean Drumbeat Series. Now, all of these were really also important in the UK as much as they were important elsewhere in the ex-colonies, because schools and universities teach literature. This is a way of reaching, if you like, a certain strata and shaping your audience. Much of the original motivation for the series had to do with the profits to be made from the numbers game, that a post-independent situation might reap profits for you if you were a publisher. There was also a kind of demand for much more local material as the educational reform hit, if you like, these kind of colonies at the point of decolonization. But I suppose what I'm saying here is that textbook publishing, literature as textbooks, sell in vast numbers. They outsell the kind of mainstream trade publication, and you have to think about that. And this shapes, if you like, the way we have a sense of how we invest in the literary tradition. In some ways, I think educational publishing is like an iceberg. The general trade publishing is only the top of it, and then there's a vast array of how books are adopted, how books are anthologized, how material is kind of harvested for schools and educational use. Okay, here I come to my other, backtrack a bit. How the series, the educational series evolved or ceased. The documentation from their archives also show a much more considered, a much more reflective and nuanced, and also much more contradictory approach to publishing, even when they were motivated by, if you like, profits. So these multinationals were also in some ways open to different kinds of writing. There were also debates about aesthetic value, about how you judge other kind of cultures when you don't come from that particular place. There was also a belief, if you like, in the intrinsic value of the work. So they're not simply kind of harvesting objects to, if you like, repackage for markets abroad. Okay, I want now to think about my third strand, which is the context of literary ecological matters and multiculturalism, which speaks to, I suppose, much more to the stuff that we're addressing here in Black, British, and Asian writing, multiculturalism in the 1980s. Now, literary and educational publishing histories have really been intimately linked with teaching and institutionalization of colonial and Black British writing, Black British and Asian writing. Decolonization led to, if you like, mainstream commercial publishers seeking to take advantage of much more locally relevant literary and educational material abroad, but this meant that the series that service other parts of the world also became available in the UK for purchase in Britain, particularly in the 80s, in the push towards multicultural educational curricular agendas. In the London, particularly in the early 80s, then overseen by the London Educational Authority. And of course, the multicultural, the push towards much more inclusive, culturally diverse kind of syllabus came from the racial disturbances of the 1970s, late 70s and early 80s, all the way through about how much you had to do more. And on the back of that, you could see the Swan Report in 1985, Education for All, endorsed an idea of a much more inclusive educational curricula. And of course, Susheila's, she's here as kind of historical persona as well. I mean, she was part of the Association of the Teaching of Caribbean, African, and Asian Literatures that was formed in 1978 to advance the education of British public in the works of African, Caribbean, and Asian origin, really in a very coordinated, organized manner through book lists. They publish lots of book lists. They stage conferences. They compile book lists of schools. They submitted recommendations to exam boards. They organized meetings, workshops. This is a really quite interesting time. And I'm kind of saying to her, I'm reading some of her little notes in the archives that I work with. And I think that's really funny as well. What do I not know of you? Okay, on the other side of the equation, in the meantime, in the UK, there were small independent presses, such as New Beacon, Bogle, the Overture. And these were the small, locally, politically driven, but also aesthetically driven small presses, which saw education as crucial, which saw culture as a form of education, the need to know and the need to address those kinds of absences in mainstream culture. So New Beacon and Bogle saw publishing, also saw publishing the ownership of the means of production, i.e. that you're not publishing on someone else's terms, but you're publishing what your communities really want. Instead of actually always being mediated by mainstream publishers, this was a way of building direct relationship with readers, plugging the gaps in a white-inflected cultural and historical curriculum. So John LaRose, Jessica Huntley, and they started the radical book fairs in London, transformed bookshops into spaces for local communities, and they can all be situated within, I suppose, an activist mode of publishing. So publishing is a form of activism rather than publishing simply for commerce. You always have to have commerce there, but there are other kinds of forms of publishing as well that inflect commerce in different kinds of ways. Because, of course, consciousness raising was so important in this particular period. And you can also locate this as part of the feminist movements and the anti-racist movements in the 80s. Independence is one key to the range of publishers that arose in this particular period. In the 80s, you think of Mango, Sheba, Kitchen Table, Only Women's Press. All of these were formative in my particular time as a student, as a postgraduate student. So there's a shared agenda between feminism, multiculturalism, and diversity of the time. So now I'm going to come back to readers, and I'm going to pose a question. I'm not going to answer it because I don't actually know the most appropriate way of answering. And this is a question about audiences, readers, and aesthetics. And my last section, and I'm going to end quite soon. Postcolonial writing and multicultural writing is more mainstream than it used to be, and I think this is a fact. And this is a result of various campaigns, interventions. This doesn't simply happen. You know, Susheila's organization at Kells was very instrumental in those days. Various campaigns against marginality. But the presence of post-colonial texts and also the presence of post-colonial text itself has an effect on the canon by making it a much more diverse educational and literary canon that we all teach and have an investment in. Well, what is the impact? Well, some of the impact on audiences and niche markets and readers are actually very contradictory, I think. For readers, these books provide access to other cultures, and one has a kind of sense of why certain writers are taken out and fated in certain kinds of ways. Might also be to do with the feeling of exoticism of those cultures that we have very little knowledge of. And this might be a way of transporting you. It's not to say that's in itself a bad thing, but what you do with that thing is something else altogether. Because, of course, there's a lovely book that I only just picked up, but it was published some time ago, called Market Aesthetics by Elena Saez. I think I'm pronouncing it wrong because it's a Spanish name. And she says that part of the driver for some of this is a kind of a demand for a reading relationship with these writers and these texts as one of knowledge and one of intimacy, that you create, if you like, a real sense of intimacy with the reader and the niche market that you are actually promoting your text to, because the book's value is then measured, and somewhat problematically, not all problematically, but somewhat problematically, by questions of authenticity. Its ability to speak culturally, authoritatively about the cultures that it represents. This might be one way of thinking back to the 1980s debates about the burden of representation, and being a cultural spokesman for the particular books that cultures that you are supposed to represent in the fiction that is on the table. For educational institutions like us, and I work in a university, that these books become teachable is another interesting way of thinking about it. In relation to questions of access, are they literary? They should be literary because we are within these particular cultural institutions and education. What are the modes of teaching these? But they become teachable in certain kinds of ways, not only in terms of aesthetics, but other kinds of ways, i.e. kind of political agendas or cultural agendas. And within a kind of post-colonial influence ethical agenda, that they signify literary resistance. This is in some ways a demand of readers going to those books, teachers teaching those books, and then also writers finding that they have to address the question of literary resistance, oppositional to, if you like, kind of forms of political and sexual authority. Now, where does this leave us? Well, I don't really know the answer to those kinds of questions. It's a very complicated, very contradictory, and enormously kind of interesting terrain to talk about. So, I will leave this and invite your kind of comments on these areas.
Okay.
So, like Gail, I also have this sense that my chapter in the CUP collection might seem to fit incongruously with the themes of this workshop series, particularly in terms of that entanglement between readership, identity, and writing. And I say this because my analysis is not entirely bound by literature, books, and textuality. My chapter examines the genre of dub poetry, a form which functions between differing sensorial modes through sight, sound, and feeling. It's not just the text and the writing that constitutes this genre, but more importantly, the sonic affectations of the words. Forged through Afro-Caribbean sounds of reggae and post-independent Jamaica, the dub poet composes verses based on the inherent beat of the words. The rhythm of reggae would come to create a euphonious poetic practice that focused on crafting words as politicized musical cadence, whether on the page, in performance, or as original music. Through the interrogation of three influential Black British dub poets, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Jean Binta Breeze, and Benjamin Zephaniah, I traced the means by which these poets cultivate sonic solidarities between Black and Asian communities in the 1970s and 1980s. The noisiness of the poetry, coupled with the text, creates the condition for auditory alliances. In these sensorial spaces, Johnson incorporates the chants of the Asian youth movements, Come What May, We Are Here to Stay. Zephaniah fuses classical Indian music with drum and bass, while Breeze manages to find a way to make sound give birth. Because of the importance of orality, the sense of hearing, the notion of reading and even writing becomes a complicated terrain in this multimodal genre. Who are the readers of dub poetry? Of Johnson, Zephaniah, and Breeze? Can we even speak about readers if the form of the text necessarily moves beyond notation and textuality? It might be more appropriate to think of this readership as an audience. Since dub poetry is often an articulation of remonstration and protest, it has at times seemed to be a genre suited for a distinctive group or audience. As Stuart Brown has argued, the duty of the dub poet is to voice the concerns of the community. He or she becomes the voice of popular discontent in ways that are exclusive to the experience of that community. Due to its civic qualities and play with forms of vernacular speech, dub poetry indeed appears to speak solely to those communities signified in the sonorous baseline of the poems. While the immanence of the politics of dub poetry is crucial, I want to suggest, in contradistinction, that its various modes of enunciation create an artistic form that is, at its best, actually transcendent. This is why, as the journalist William Tenifieni noted in an interview with Carol Phillips, even French audiences know all the words to Linton Kwesi Johnson's verses. In other words, the so-called readership of dub poetry radically shifts and is rarely exclusive, in part because the poetry exists in multiple forms. Take, for instance, Johnson's poem, It Dread in England. The poem is dedicated to George Lindo, who was wrongfully arrested for robbing a Bradford betting office in August 1977. His imprisonment would eventually lead to the lengthy Free George Lindo campaign in which Johnson played a crucial role. In April of 1978, with over 300 protesters gathered at the police station in Bradford, Johnson, armed with a megaphone, amplified his verses to the crowd. It Dread in England has many material lives. It is literally a protest verse voiced on the steps of a police station. Soon after, in the same year, it first appeared in print in the radical magazine Race Today, and subsequently released on the LP Dread Beaten Blood. It featured again in Johnson's third collection of poetry, England is a Bitch, in 1980. Each version of the poem, whether at a demonstration, in a political magazine, on a music record, or book of poetry, represents the intersection of differing readerships and audiences. Those who listen, read, watch, and feel the words can be engaged politically, artistically, locally, nationally, and globally. Thinking through the specific performative aspects of dub poetry, the words themselves can even be irretrievable. As Walter Ong has suggested, sound exists only when it is going out of existence. Each readership, then, attests to the complex, multivalent, and ephemeral material histories of the verses. These histories incorporate not only distinctive mechanisms of writing, but also the technologies and the embodied experience of sound. It Dread in England was republished in 2002 in Johnson's Penguin Modern Classic collection, Me Revolutionary Friend, making him the first Black poet and second living poet to have a modern classics text. Was this the moment that dub poetry became great writing? For an anti-establishment genre that's been described by various critics and collections as rage and belligerent overstatement, tedious jabber, and shrill denunciation, its imprint as a classics seemed an odd move. Even Johnson was surprised. I wondered, he tells us, if it was some kind of plot to undermine my street cred. Johnson's induction into the classic series provoked conversations about what constitutes great, or in this case, canonical writing. Can a form of writing that does not even privilege the page count? To my mind, the answer is simple. Of course it can. Great writing manages to somehow transcend categories and genres. Great writers mock, function at the limits of, and often obliterate boundaries. We see the most profoundly paradoxical version of this with Johnson's classics text. As a poet who's dedicated to specific local issues and who explicitly writes against hierarchies of taste, culture, and methods of making meaning in the literary realm, Johnson somehow connects beyond what we might think to be the boundaries of his work. The multimodality of dub poetry has everything to do with this connection. Ironically, then, with this genre in mind, great writing can include texts that have significant extra-textual lives. Writers like Johnson are great precisely by working against this categorical moniker altogether. It is through the various iterations of these verses that a constellation of utterances form which entangle the lives of Black British youths in the 1970s with young French-Arab concertgoers in the 1990s. French audiences know all the words to Johnson's verses because the localized socio-political context represented on the page, through the voice, and in the music, clairvoyantly beg unexpected forms of identification. The greatness of Linton Kwesi Johnson and the genre of dub poetry in general counterintuitively lies in the latent connections embedded in the artistry that have yet to come. This is a form of transcendence and futurity that cannot exist without the synesthetic understanding of concretized context and material lives.
My task then here is really to think about this idea of claiming the centre, the way in which British, Black and Asian cinema, drama, television and new media have actually penetrated the mainstream. And I think there are some very, very serious questions that need to be answered in that regard. A lot of this is pushed onto the 2002 moment with the huge success of Bedded Like Beckham, which has a direct lineage to more art house aesthetics of My Beautiful Laundrette that are being transformed and bent into a very, very different kind of direction by Virinder Chadha. So though attention has only recently been paid to the production of Black and Asian British writing for stage, film, radio, television, the first decade of the 21st century has seen an upsurge in these outputs by writers from Asian and Black British backgrounds and increased recognition in the mainstream. I'm particularly thinking here about what it means for these texts to be produced for mainstream audiences and to be consumed by mainstream audiences as well. So as I say, 2002, particularly for British Asian filmmaking, was a huge year. Similarly, the staging of a triptych of plays in 2003 by Kwame Kwei Armah There they are. Amina's Kitchen, Fix Up, and Statement of Regret also marked a very, very important cultural moment, and it's perhaps the first moment where the audiences at the National Theatre started to exponentially diversify. This has led some commentators to claim that the increased success of these works has significantly shifted the way in which Britain conceives of itself as a nation, and has led some to consider this breakthrough as a moment of arrival for Black and Asian British productions in Britain's cultural mainstream. That's very much the lie of the land in 2005, where there's the Blair moment as well, where this wonderful multicultural nation here is expressed on our screens, on our stages. Let's pat ourselves on the shoulder and carry on. Well, the lie of the land now is very, very different. It's an assertion that is increasingly being challenged, especially by actors from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, Idris Elba, Lenny Henry in particular, who are campaigning for more diversity and for an increase in roles for Black British acting talent on British screens. And there is still also obviously enormous problems with the lack of colourblind casting in theatre especially. What then is interesting is that popular continuing dramas such as EastEnders, Emmerdale, Casualty and Coronation Street feature Asian or Black British characters much more organically than as we see them sometimes perhaps in cinema or in on the stage. It is also true to say that the number of writers from Asian and Black British backgrounds writing for these continuing dramas is proportionally low. So what then is at stake for Black and Asian British stories to be told in the mainstream, and how we might consume them? As I say, drama, film are collaborative ventures and collaborative endeavours. So we already, again, also face a challenge of classification when we're looking at these films. Think about My Beautiful Laundrette, written by Hanif Qureshi, but directed by Stephen Frears. Can we consider it an Asian British film? Do we consider it purely on subject matter of the writer, but what then happens to the role of the director? Or what about the Windrush musical, The Big Life? 2004, the co-production between Theatre Royal Stratford East and then the Kenwright brought it into the West End, which very successfully ran at the Apollo Theatre. But it was written by an English dramatist, Paul Sirrett, but directed by British Caribbean director Clint Dyer. So, in other words, to be considered a Black or Asian British cultural product is story and subject matter more important than the writer? And what then about our engagement as spectator, as reader, with this? Do these productions challenge the primary position of the writer? As the push into the mainstream then is premised increasingly on a cross-pollination that combusts such binary distinctions, perhaps these works need to be considered through this wider prism of collaboration by focusing on creative process, how Black and Asian British stories are actually presented to mainstream audiences through a range of media. So if we start to take account of these creative and organizational collaborations, which are increasingly at the forefront of bringing Black and Asian British stories to mainstream audiences, perhaps a more nuanced picture can be drawn around the successes and failures of these endeavours in their questioning of notions of British national identity. So it's very interesting to see that Bend It Like Beckham as a film was hugely successful in 2002, but was a massive flop when it was turned into a musical in 2015, ran for less than 12 months. It's one of the few flops that Sonia Friedman, who's a very, very successful theatre producer, has had. So while the first decade of the new millennium marks an increased visibility of these productions in Britain's cultural mainstream that seek to engage a broader and more diverse audience, the second decade, the 21st century, offers perhaps a more sobering perspective, with a distinct reduction of plays by Black and Asian British playwrights on the major national stages, and broadcasting outlets of the UK, and a representation of Asian and Black British life that often panders to stereotypes. And the one that is often cited in regard to this is Citizen Khan. Perhaps in an earlier phase also, the Kumas at number 42, which was sort of a follow-on from the same team that did the very radical Goodness Gracious Me in the late 1990s. Here there are accusations of Uncle Tomism in particular. It marked a major falling out between Mira Sayal and Gurinder Chadha as well. In some ways then, this whole questioning of a burden of representation lies at the heart of the discussions that I want to stage in my chapter, which to me remain very, very valid in relation to the cultural productions that we have, and the way in which Black and Asian British lives are presented to us on screen. And I'm wondering to some extent how far the collaborative process can actually help us to further nuance some of these representations. And an interesting case study for that are actually some of the dramas we have seen on our screens. Whether it was the period drama of Small Island, it was turned into, Life Isn't All Ha Ha He He, which was an adaptation of Mira Sayal's novel, or one of the most recent ones, NW. And I think NW is a very, very interesting case in point here. Again, a screenplay writer who is white British collaborating with a Black British writer to adapt the novel for television. And here, while this is a narrative that has Black British lives very much at their centre, it is also one that is very much a state of the nation story in that microcosm of North London. It is, in some ways, can be read as a post-credit crunch, crash, austerity drama at the same time. And this is very much the kind of aesthetic that it took in its representations. And I'm going to conclude really, and these are really a number of provocations and questions that I wanted to push out with, and how the terminology and some of the questions around definitions that we're all happening. While there have been, of course, these very high-profile successes, I think those successes also need to be questioned, and particularly what impact some of these successes actually have on the writers as well. And this is really a question that emanates from this increasing visibility. So if there is a push for mainstream recognition, and has enabled perhaps on the one hand more nuanced, sometimes more stereotypical representation, and has it really done enough to pull the writer in from the margins? Is it here perhaps where a darker underside can also be detected? The Black British writers only asked to write on Black subjectivity. Can we really consider a sense of arrival as a form of success, of having claimed the mainstream? Or are we actually perpetuating similar kinds of stereotypes? The case study here that is very interesting is that of the writer Avril Rogers, who was one of the co-writers of the successful 2008 miniseries Baby Father, who noted in a 2014 interview in The Independent that the series made her fall into a deep, dark pigeonhole, that as a consequence meant her losing out on commissions. Before Baby Father and its success, she would write on long-running continuing dramas like The Bill. After that, all of this dried up. Suddenly she would only be offered material to adapt on Black British subjects, nothing else, which she wasn't interested in doing. How then does contemporary Britain engage the African Caribbean community living in Britain and vice versa? How do cultural productions articulate the problem of the Black British community in multicultural Britain? And it's in addressing these kinds of questions that perhaps a combination of a change in perception within Britain and a more conscious sense of its multicultural, multi-ethnic self has allowed for these plays to reach broader audiences, but perhaps has not done enough to challenge persistent stereotypes. That's where I'm going to leave it.
Thank you.
We'd love to open it up to the floor for questions. Yeah.
I've got two connected questions. First of all, I thought the panel was really fascinating. Thank you very much. And congratulations on this really important project. Secondly, these are connected. Is there going to be a digital form of the history? Because if so, would that help with the kind of leakage? The sense of not wanting to contain things, because you can click much more easily than you're likely to see page 54 or whatever. And secondly, what do you do about the categories of Black and Asian British when there might be dialogue with non-Black and non-Asian British writing? Because that's another whole sort of compartmentalisation.
Who would like to respond to something? Yeah? Do you want to?
I don't really have a cogent response to that. I certainly am nostalgic for the time in which Black included everything. I like the sense that the idea of Black is a much more, as Stuart Hall said, a much more complicated story. That if you ask someone where they're from, there's a huge narrative behind it. It's not simple anymore. We published a series of essays on the little magazine I run called Dura, Dundee University Review of the Arts. And the essay today, in chime with this, was an essay on African American representation in art. I can't quite remember the title now because it's kind of gone out of my head. But it's to also maybe foreground the sense of Black as complicated but also performative. So there is no self-evident category, if you like, that we take to be kind of a product of the way you look, etc. And part of the debate in that essay was, Barack Obama, the huge salon debate about that. You can't call him a Black president because he is in some ways has white ancestry. So there's a kind of interesting debate about Black in that term. And I think the complications matter and they should be there.
Maybe I'll add to that. Thanks very much. Two questions, which I think are wonderful. You also asked, the first point was about digital format, and we have talked about it. We're not sure it's going to happen. We see that it would be very, very valuable. On the one hand, it has to do with, does CUP want to do it and which form would it take? But the other problem might well be one would have to maintain it. One would have to keep adding to it. If it was, say, something like a website that complements the book. Ideally, yes, we would have a corpus of text that add to it.
I just meant, would it be available
digitally as a book? Yes, it will be. I think all Cambridge
another author, then you just click.
Yeah, that's definitely
that will be the case. That will be the case.
Oh, yeah.
But we also talked about doing particularly with some of these material histories, where as Gail knows, you have lists and lists of organisations or networks, some that lasted 1 year, some that lasted 10, that have kind of disappeared, but were quite important for different reasons. And one of the contributors who's not here, Nicola Abraham, had a wonderful list of all of these. Who's at the University of Reading, who was virtually at our symposium at Munster, and we wanted to create some, and also sort of like a discography, some kind of resource, but I think in the end we decided it was one leg too far for us at the moment. With 42 contributors and I don't know, over 79 writers being counted. But we would like to do it in ideal terms, and maybe it can still happen in the future. And the other question, of course, you've said, answered it already, but I wanted to add, it did come out of Florian's talk already. It's going to remain open, really, how the signifiers Black and Asian are being used. We're going to have to talk about it, historicize those terms in the introduction,
and invite the individual contributors to, contextualize it for the specific chapters, but there won't be, you can consider Colin McInnes, although he's a white writer, because of the stories he tells, but we're certainly not going to say the thematics of the cultural product are the all-defining element. Henghameh's paper made it quite clear that, the generic specificity comes in, but then what would you do with a white poet? So it's a question, and I think it has to remain a question for it to be productive. So the notion of the performative is really helpful here. Now, at the same time, of course, these are political terms, so you cannot just be playful and postmodern about them. So that's the tension that we spell out and under which we operate. The question won't go away; it will remain a question.
I mean, it's difficult in my chapter in particular because in terms of the history of film production, Asian cinema, Asian British cinema develops on a very different trajectory to Black British cinema. There's a real split between that. Whereas in drama, it does emerge out of that 1970s moment and consideration of an idea of blackness, actually, that is shared across communities, that very political moment. So even within a chapter, those debates, I think, was quite interesting in the symposium that we had in Münster last year, that all of us who were writing chapters were exactly wrestling with the same question of how to frame Black and Asian together, and whether this was even still a tenable proposition, actually, which is a huge argument, I think, to be had.
Just last point to that, on the controversy of this, Idris Elba's Gorilla, the TV series, when people were quite upset that there was a South Asian woman activist, and the director was defending it through this notion of political blackness. Well, where are the black women? So this question of what black constitutes is very, very important and really controversial still. And as everyone's been saying, everyone grapples with it in different ways, which is why I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
There's John.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for a great panel. It was really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading the book as a whole. I had a question, maybe it's a comment, but I'd really like you to respond to it. Something, and then it also kind of, I was already thinking it, and then it came up in the video, which I'd missed before, was the kind of, all of these chapters that we've heard from kind of expose the fallacy of reading as a kind of solitary act. Whether it's in the kind of print networks and the kind of New Beacon kind of sort of activism stuff, these are real places with people mingling together. In Gail's chapter, or whether it's the dance hall and the protest march, or whether it's the cinema and the theatre. And I mean, maybe this isn't literature, but it is writing, and writing has to be read, right? So there's something about reading and I don't know. I feel like I grew up inherited an idea of reading as a solitary activity from somewhere, and I don't know where that is, and clearly that's not true. So I wondered if you wanted to respond to that.
Well, at least you call it an activity, which is a good thing, because often some people consider reading to be something that's almost passive, right? You're doing nothing, you're just sitting there, or you're just reading a book, and it's seen also as part of leisure time, but actually. Where precisely that kind of intellectual engagement, that kind of idea of opening up a world, of inhabiting perhaps also sometimes a different skin, comes into that, and taking yourself out of that comfort zone becomes very, very important. I think, perhaps I overstated it a little bit too much in terms of the idea of a shared spectatorship, because ultimately it is still solitary insofar as it's you and your own engagement with whatever happens on stage or on the screen, but yet it becomes something different by having other people sitting next to you. Maybe it's replicated in the form of book clubs where books are concerned, or
in classrooms.
Yes.
Or
yes, absolutely. Or even through audiobooks and podcasts which are increasingly used in All People's Homes, for example. So I think it's a really, really important
point actually that you're making there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think in terms of dub poetry, though, it's always been communal. So that's not an odd concept at all with the genre. I guess my work has tried to... I quoted Stuart Brown, who's dub poetry is about one specific community, and he's right in many ways. It's localized verses, and they don't tend to, you would think, don't tend to move beyond a certain group, not an individual. But my work, I'm trying to kind of move beyond that. It's not just one group, but multiple groups, in ways that may not be noted. So a lot of dub poems will specifically note groups, institutions, ethnicities, whatever. But there's a kind of latent identification that, as I mentioned with the French concert, that Arab youths are drawing from, for instance, that isn't noted in the text itself. So I think as a genre, it is inherently communal. And I guess it's up to the readers, critics, audience members, who you never know which direction identification will go, to expand those boundaries.
I mean, I don't really have much to add. I mean, you've said it all in some ways, but I would say writing is also collaborative. The book is also collaborative. It's not simply the author, whatever we take the author to be.
Can I also say, I mean, just to counter all of that, that we cover many authors in this history, whom I imagine have readers who are solitary. And read in the more, if you like, traditional way. I mean, like V.S. Naipaul, for example.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, actually, the question is also interesting because of broadcast programs. If you hear radio, and that's also a shared experience. You know, Caribbean Voices being the kind of most prime example of that. That's a shared response to a performance of a reading on radio that people talked about and kind of actively commented on, and you can see some of that in letters.
And it was also a platform for, as most Caribbean Voices and the Eastern Service was, as a platform for new modernities, new writing.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
To formulate a new way of writing, because they could not publish so easily in the mainstream at that point.
We have more questions, I think.
So I want to thank you all for that really rich panel. I have a question I'm trying to formulate that will, I think, ask a question of the last three presenters, but linked to the ways that you all framed it in terms of translocal, transglobal, and the messiness of trying to categorize or even pull this collection together. So I wondered what would happen if we think about global market, like you've been inviting us to do, and a global audience. And so one example for that, in the last presenter, I was thinking about NW. And the other film, the writer for Baby Father, who says that after that, I've been pigeonholed. And I was thinking about the fact that NW could be adapted in the UK, and yet it has a global audience, and yet the global audience will never get the local context, right? Like, I couldn't see, for example, NW having a home in the US, meaning on screen. And so I wondered if you could, any of you, speak to that question about how this global audience plays into the way that you're thinking through this sort of British frame that is both at home and yet really trans-global in its reach within certain genres. And then related to that, I think this question is for...
My name, probably.
Yes. This question is for you, and I was thinking about, so I found it refreshing to hear the ways that dub was traveling. And I often hear that on the other side of the pond around hip-hop. And so I wondered, why is it that dub had the particular resonance that it did with this French and Arab audience, with the Arab youth, that hip-hop did or didn't, or the ways in which it complements or challenges. So, just thinking about the audience in that way.
So we've got two questions there. Who wants to go on the global one first of all? Anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, I think it would find a home on somewhere like HBO, actually. And a lot of, I mean, what's quite interesting is that a lot of drama programs, particularly because the BBC is so strapped for cash, are now co-productions anyway. So they are already made with, well, trans global audiences, I guess, in mind, and not just local audiences. But I think it's also, this similarly goes for writers as well. I mean, Zadie Smith now lives in New York, and yet has got and continues to maintain that real sense of the local, of NW of Kilburn and its surrounding area. And although she said, I think this was probably going to be the last novel that she's going to very much set within that environment. She's moving to something else now. But I think just, you know, so I think there are different linkages here in terms of your own positioning, your own re-experiencing of the local, but certainly you don't get a sense there that there's a reconfiguration of that space from a detached New Yorker's lens. So that interrelationship remains. But I think there is also a connection of experience that goes beyond the local. So James Proctor at Newcastle was running a very interesting project on reading groups, and they were based across the globe, but one specifically in Glasgow, living on an estate that was faced with demolition and the dissolution of community, responded extraordinarily well to achieve as things fall apart. And that was, so that there is a complete imaginative leap that was happening there, but it felt to them what is happening in that novel was exactly what was happening to them. So I don't want to overplay here this notion of the universal versus the particular, but I think there is something that goes beyond that rootedness in the local that allows us to connect with these cultural productions.
Yeah, and I think also that the global, although again it may have been described slightly differently, was very much at in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. It's really actually post the Second World War in Britain that this idea of the global got narrowed down. I mean, most of these writers, so many of the writers we're covering in the book were global travellers, imaginatively speaking, and in terms of who they were bicultural, bilingual. They looked in several directions at once, and these things. So I guess they kind of got narrowed down after the war, but I mean so in a sense that global question does, I suppose, impact. It's an interesting question across the whole book in a way.
Equiano travels usually. I mean, it's a prime example. Just to respond, I guess, directly to the hip-hop question, the big difference here is dub poetry is not interested in the market like hip-hop would be. This notion of selling out, this notion of selling out is a big deal. Stuart Brown, in that article I mentioned, just to be in a book is to sell out as a dub poet, right? So that in itself, Zephaniah has got claims of selling out. I mean, the conversation expands this way. So Linton refused Island Records. Right, he has his own company, record label company. So it is fascinating the appeal without those market mechanisms that certain dub poets do have. And I think it just goes back to what Florian was saying, that connections you wouldn't think would be connections are. Dub poetry in Canada, for instance, is a booming field. And there are lots of fantastic female dub poets at the moment, and they're really popular through the internet, through pamphlets, right, through word of mouth, through books. They're fascinating, but they may not have the market support that larger writers or musicians may have. So it is a little bit of a different ball game, so to speak. But it's a fantastic question, and the comparisons are really there, I think.
There was a second question, which I can't now remember, but
I got it. Check.
All right.
Check.
I thought you were, but
yeah. Just a small addendum to that, I suppose. The question is, how do you speak to local readers and local spaces and local places and local readers, and yet also be global? And of course, that's quite a tricky kind of kettle of fish, because I think sometimes the valorization of things that travel easily at the expense of things that are very local is something, again, that we need to think about quite carefully. So it's not always the case that things that travel well, things that are broadcast well, things that are picked up by mainstream publishers that are then promoted globally are necessarily the only kind of thing that we ought to look at, and the only kind of literature that actually excels at what it does. And some things don't travel well, but that's, I think, also a good thing. But in terms of publishing, it's really quite interesting now, I think. I mean, if you look at something like a small press, and to my mind it's a small press, smallish press, like People Tree in Leeds, and they publish out of Leeds. They publish essentially for an American market, and they publish for a Caribbean market. And Jeremy pointing actually up front says that. And of course they have American editors, or Quote Me Dawes is in the US. So it's quite a strange thing, what is local and what is global now. I think it's really much complicated and much more interesting.
I have a very complicated question, which I'm trying to formulate. But before I do that, many of us in the room know Louisa Lane, who right now is trying to finish her thesis on Linton Kwesi Johnson. And one of the headaches of proofing this thesis has been Linton's non-standard spelling. So she had to take the spell check off. Because Dread, Beat and Blood is different. Is for every single kind of incarnation. It's you know, so that just to illustrate the non-commercial that you were just touching on, and to bring Louisa's name into the room. So my question is, I suppose, in a nutshell, here you have your Cambridge history, and I'm wondering about the political role that you see, you editors in particular, I suppose, you see it as playing, and whether through having that Cambridge imprint and through, if you like, combining the words Cambridge, Black and Asian and British, you will be able to speak to sort of canons and processes of canonization. Gail touched on this, and also syllabuses and processes of syllabus reform. I mean, it's still the case, and this is one of the drivers behind this series, it's still the case that in the Oxford English degree, you can move from week 1 of the first year to the final week of the final year and not work on or read a single writer of colour. Of any period or any time. You really have to go out, you have to go to, you know, the option papers if you kind of want to broaden the curriculum. So what we wanted, one of the questions behind the series was, what happens when, if you like, an absolutely mainstream reader who perhaps has an Oxford or Cambridge or, I don't know, UCL degree in literature and English, when they encounter this material, what happens at that point? Are there processes of estrangement, of alienation, of feeling part of a community, or of feeling shut out of a community? And how can we in some way harness those processes of either feeling part of or feeling alienated and wanting to do something about that to, you know, work with, to widen the curriculum? So, and surely it will give you a really powerful instrument in putting those, you know, those words, Cambridge, history, Black, Asian, British, together.
Well, that is a complicated question,
I
isn't
mean,
it?
I don't know. I mean, I agree. I mean, basically, I'd say yes, that those are all issues. A bit I cut out of my presentation was actually about some major universities still actually only having these kinds of writers on the syllabus as options, or as regional studies, or whatever they call them. Yes, I mean, I think that quote from Eddie Bohr, there's no such, which goes back to this article I wrote in the 1980s, there's no such thing as only literature. Yes, there is a whole political issue to do with it, and I think the point really is that we do actually want to keep it open, but we do also want to put, if you like, those post-colonial canonical writers in there, and we've got many of them, of course, alongside perhaps a lot of writers that people have never heard of, but who are written about properly and critically, and in the sense that Gail Low was talking about it, you know, in terms of institutionalizing something, they're on a platform together, and hopefully that will permeate through. But that's, you know, it is an ongoing, as you know, a constantly ongoing battle, isn't it? Really, even with you know the editor, you know, the Ray Ryan at CUP, we were having to negotiate some of these chapters, weren't we? So.
My take on that wonderful question would be very much in tune with what you've said, of course, i.e., you know, there are lectures, there are programs called something like From Beowulf to Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's fair enough. But you need to supplement that with From Equiano to Evaristo.
Yeah.
And, you know, it has to...
No, but you need to supplement it with From Beowulf to Evaristo.
Hang on. And you have to then, you know, point out the intersections between those materials as well, right? So it has to be intertwined. So it's not so much about producing an alienating effect, which, you know, was contained in your question, but to open up this field, but to open it up, as you've said, properly and with the appropriate respect, and also with the appropriate sort of methodological protocols. You cannot just, you know, pick up those texts and read them and ignore, you know, their histories, what they stand for, the generic, you know, specificities that came out in your two papers today, and the material history of how those texts have come about. So I think, you know, that is what we hope, or one element at least, of what we hope to achieve. So, you know, I think it is significant that this book is coming out now, and it will highlight writers who've, you know, appeared and disappeared. So it resurrects voices. I think that's quite important. Elike, we were at a conference together in Tübingen probably 20 years ago, and I gave a paper on Hanif Qureshi, and the panel was called Indian Literature. And I took offense to that, right? But at that time, it's hard to imagine it now, but there was no Black British writing at the level of conferences. So it's quite, not the literature, but the term in the academy is of quite a recent provenance. So it just shows one needs to engage, I think, as a critic with this field, as you were saying, with teaching, but also with how, you know, how research is conducted. And I think, you know, certainly since, you know, names like Sam Rushdie or Zadie Smith, you know, a lot of mainstream attention has been directed at this field. It is very selective. It's only a handful of writers that have, you know, gotten that sort of attention, and that needs to be complemented by much more in-depth coverage, which, you know, this history is trying to provide. What we're also aware of is, however, that I teach in Germany, as you said in the introduction earlier, a lot of the effect of this emphasis on Black British and British Asian writing has been that writing from Africa, writing from the Caribbean, writing from Asia more generally, etc., has sort of retreated into the background. So that's the other thing I think we need to negotiate. So Black British writing, British Asian is quite popular these days, and in terms of the, you know, from a post-colonial perspective, there has to be a balance. Now we can't do that within our book, but from a post-colonial studies perspective, that's something we also have to see. So the very location you mentioned, Leeds, you know, publishing from the UK, you know, gives those writers a lot of cachet that the writers, say, in Africa don't have. So that's at the back of my mind, certainly, with this project too.
Can I
take? Sorry.
Go ahead.
There's that tricky. I was actually going to touch on your presentation there, Florian. There's that tricky negotiation of the centre and the periphery. I mean, I was when I was reading for the English Ref panel, one of my medieval colleagues said to me, "How can you possibly read this medieval material?" Because I couldn't possibly read your post-colonial material.
But you can, yeah.
You know, so it's those questions of I know it's you know, an insane question, but what it points to is that for some readers there are barriers in certain texts or around certain authors' names that are lower or higher depending on their cultural familiarity.
But then that, I mean, I want to take up 2 points actually. But the one thing that is important, firstly, that
bookshops stop segregating. That they actually let's get rid of the specialist sections and suddenly have an Abdulrazak Gurnah next to a Graham Greene, or a Zadie Smith next to an Ali Smith, or a Shams Salvadorian next to a Sam Salvan, and actually think about this in a much more global kind of way. Literature is literature, and I know they sometimes do that, it makes it easier to find, but actually I recently went through a slightly crazy process and reorganized my entire library at home alphabetically. And it actually it's quite interesting to see, once you get rid of the regions, that different connections become actually a possibility. And I'm wondering whether we, as educators in universities, and I've had a similar thing, and since 2013 I've been pushing at Exeter to try and help diversify the curriculum, and I've got some good support, and there's some good people around me that are willing and open to doing that, and perhaps more open so in the 20th century modernists and Americanists who are willing to do that. But it was initially a very, very hard sell. But the conversations have become very different as part of that process, and students' engagement and actually the kind of dissertations that they're writing too have become much more globally engaged, rather than what you would have seen when I first arrived back in 2013. So it can be done, but I think, as you say, I think it needs to be a respectful dialogue with which you are engaging, and meet each other on a level playing field. And when you suddenly then see the kind of possible connections between these literatures, that's when you start shifting, rather than thinking about Daljit Nagra's got a wonderful poem in Look We're Coming to Dover, where this father on the GCSE anthology thinks, why are these Indian writers presented as other? They're not other, I'm not other, I'm British. So my poetry should be seen as British as well as same thing. And I think it's that kind of conversation that we need to have more, I think, amongst ourselves, but also, I think, with our students.
Yes.
If I could just add a really quick comment to that, just super quick. I also think it's about looking at aesthetics as well. So my Intro to English Lit course, I start poetry with Johnson. I started with dub poetry because, obviously, dub is neglected, yes, but because I genuinely think it's the best way to start a conversation about cadence, about beat, that will help students with Shakespeare. So it's about aesthetics for me, and that's really helpful, and so students bring in that conversation with Blake and what have you. So turning to aesthetics, I think, is really, really crucial in that super important question that you asked.
Yeah, I would teach kind of Daberdeen alongside Piers Plummet, for example. You know, that would be a way of enriching both sides and making the other relevant. Yeah. The question of what we go to literature for is such a difficult question. You know, what kinds of demands is literature to fulfill? You know, and I feel quite ambivalent, divided, and don't quite know how to think through, because on the one hand I've lived through all of that 80s demand for a kind of oppositional agenda, which is very politicized through the 80s, through the late 70s, 80s. And then on the other hand, which then sometimes aesthetics go out of the question. And then I'm thinking, well, literature doesn't do what I want it to do. It's not oppositional in the way, it doesn't translate into politics in quite a straightforward way. So it's, I think, quite a tricky kind of, but you know this anyway.
But a book, ultimately a book like this hopefully will create
spaces.
More spaces and more educated readers, so that you don't have, as I had on one occasion, an editor from the paper asking me who Derek Walcott was.
That was like 20 years ago?
No, about 10 years ago.
Is there a final question that we can close with? Question to the panel?
Well, actually, Elika, you voiced it, but I have been thinking this all the way through, because sadly I missed the other papers, but I did come here just in time to hear Florian. I'm going to catch up. I will look at them on the website. And the question about the mainstream and the margins and the peripheries really does bug me. And I just think in terms of cinematic production, you've got that already wrapped up into the idea of a production, because some elements will be mainstream, some will be marginal. And every production wants to capture the maximum attention, so they will try their hardest, one way or another, to get a well-known author, a well-known star, or a well-known producer. That's my hunch.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've got any comment on that.
Well,
but
I think it's also to do with aesthetics and sensibility, actually, that is generated within the whole production process, and actually in the final product that you get in the end. It's in the editing, it's in sound, it's in the whole mise en scène that you get with that. I don't think you could, it would be very hard to describe My Beautiful Laundrette as a mainstream film in many ways, even though it may have become that. But it's quite interesting because I teach it, and my students react quite viscerally is the wrong word, but it's sort of, there is something alienating about it. There's something that they're put off by, whether it's some of the more surrealist elements that are in there. It's a very overlayered narrative. Whereas the reaction I get to when I screen something like Bend It Like Beckham is a completely different one, because it riffs on these very familiar themes, from romantic comedy to a coming-of-age story that you get, and it's produced particularly to entice you to recognize a genre that you're very familiar with, and then pull you into the other story that is perhaps less mainstream that it tries to do. Whereas My Beautiful Laundrette, in the immediate opening with the washing machine, the bubbly sound that you get, already pulls you into a completely different direction. And I think, if you look at the work of John Comfort in particular, he retains this kind of more troubling aesthetic very, very deliberately, not wanting to push his filmmaking into the mainstream. And I think this idea of the mainstream very much comes together, I think, in terms of recognizable tropes, recognizable character types that you've seen, and recognizable genre that come together, that are immediately recognizable, that might be just set in a different kind of milieu. Whereas the art house very much tries to rupture the ordinary and tries to unthink and trouble those kinds of aesthetics, which some of these mainstream things don't do. So I do agree that there are cultural productions that blur or try to blur these kinds of boundaries, and I think you're right, we need to think about the fissures and the kind of messiness a little bit more, rather than clear-cut distinctions.
Actually saying it needs to be more nuanced, but I think
it is.
the nuance is already embedded, as it were.
Absolutely. Well, okay, yeah, I do take that point. I think it is easier to achieve that in drama than it is in film or television, actually.
I think Alec is very keen to close this panel, rightly so.
Right.
We from the panel want to thank you for coming here on such a lovely day. I know you
sitting in the garden by the river.
You would have had alternatives. There's a gentleman with a UE t-shirt here. Now, they have a department of literatures in English, so it's not the English department, it's the department of literatures in English, and I like that, the plurality implied there. And I do also want to get back to Florian saying he re-alphabetized his book collection. I think the books that we cover in that history, they belong on many shelves, they belong in many locations, so they have more than one place.
Absolutely.
But more importantly, they belong on all our bookshelves, no matter on which community we feel we belong to. So we want to also promote that, right? That those books physically, materially, travel into libraries and into personal collections. Whether then they're alphabetized or you sort them by the color of their spine is not up to me. But get those books and read them. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And if you do want to protest against categories, I noticed to my horror that Blackwell's, I last looked at the modern fiction about, 2-3 weeks ago, and the mainstream is in one section, and then there's writing from Asia, and then there's writing from the Caribbean. So it's all become
Yeah. Segregation. Yeah.
It is very defined.
Yeah.
Indeed, and I think this actually goes against the spirit of negotiation and kind of working between centres and clusters of centres that we've been talking about. So what you could go and do is go to Blackwell's and kind of import the